The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of Farm Road 1176, creating heat mirages that danced like ghosts in the distance. Margaret Eleanor Whitfield, known to her few remaining friends as Maggie, shuffled along the shoulder of the road, her worn sneakers leaving small puffs of dust with each labored step. At 68 years old, she had never imagined she would find herself walking 3 miles in the scorching heat, carrying nothing but a tattered purse containing her last $5 and a faded photograph of her late husband, Robert James Whitfield. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was walking toward the Strait ranch, the same property where she had spent countless summer afternoons as a child, playing with George and his siblings, while their parents discussed cattle prices and weather patterns over sweet tea on the front porch. That was back when the Whitfield farm was thriving, when her father, Thomas Whitfield, was considered one of the most successful ranchers in Pearsall, and when the future seemed as endless as the Texas sky. Maggie paused to catch her breath, leaning against a weathered fence post that marked the beginning of what she remembered as the old Henderson property. The land had changed hands 3 times since she was a girl, but the memories remained vivid. She could almost hear her mother, Sarah Whitfield, calling her in for supper, her voice carrying across the fields like a gentle bell. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, because they were. The arthritis in her knees sent sharp reminders with each step that her body wasn't designed for this kind of journey anymore. Dr. Patricia Coleman had warned her about overexertion during her last visit to the county clinic, but that was before the eviction notice, before her children had made their final devastating choices, and before she had eaten her last can of soup 3 days ago. Her stomach growled audibly, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Maggie pressed her hand against her abdomen, trying to quiet the persistent ache that had become her constant companion. She had grown accustomed to hunger over the past 2 weeks, but the weakness in her legs was new, frightening in its intensity. The first sign of the Strait property appeared as she crested a small hill, a pristine white fence that seemed to stretch for miles in both directions. Even from a distance, she could see that the ranch had expanded significantly since her childhood. What had once been a modest cattle operation now sprawled across hundreds of acres, with multiple buildings dotting the landscape like a small town unto itself. Maggie's heart began to race, though whether from exertion or anxiety she couldn't tell. What was she doing? What kind of desperate person shows up unannounced at someone's door after 50 years, begging for food? The shame burned hotter than the sun on her shoulders, but the alternative was worse. She had already swallowed her pride when she called her daughter, Jennifer Lynn Morrison, in Dallas 3 weeks ago. "Mom, you know I'd love to help, but Brad's law practice is struggling, and the kids need so much for school," Jennifer had said, her voice distant and rehearsed. "Maybe you should look into those government programs for seniors. I'm sure there's something available." Her son, Michael Robert Whitfield, had been even more direct when she reached him in Houston. "Look, Mom, Dad left you that house for a reason. Sell it, downsize, and stop expecting us to bail you out every time you can't manage your finances." What neither of them understood, or cared to understand, was that there was no equity left in the house. Robert's cancer treatment had consumed their savings, their retirement fund, and eventually forced them to mortgage the farm that had been in the Whitfield family for 3 generations. The medical bills continued to arrive months after his funeral, each one a cruel reminder that love couldn't conquer everything, no matter what the songs claimed. A distant rumble caught her attention, and Maggie looked up to see a pickup truck approaching from behind. Instinctively, she stepped further onto the shoulder, though there was little room between the asphalt and the drainage ditch. The truck, a newer model Ford F-150 in metallic blue, slowed as it approached, and Maggie felt a flutter of panic. She had heard too many stories about women her age being targeted by criminals who preyed on the vulnerable. The truck pulled alongside her and stopped, the engine idling quietly. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a man in his 40s wearing a cowboy hat and a concerned expression. "Ma'am, are you all right? It's mighty hot to be walking out here." Relief washed over Maggie as she recognized the voice and face of Deputy Sheriff Marcus Anthony Reeves, a man she had known since he was a teenager, working part-time at Henderson's feed store. "Marcus, is that you?" "Mrs. Whitfield, Lord Almighty, what are you doing out here on foot?" Marcus immediately put the truck in park and stepped out, his uniform crisp despite the heat. "You're going to get heat stroke walking in this sun." Maggie felt tears threatening but forced them back. She had cried enough over the past few months to last several lifetimes. "I'm fine, Marcus. Just taking a walk." "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're 3 miles from town and heading toward the Strait place. That's not exactly a casual stroll." Marcus's brown eyes were kind but persistent. "When's the last time you had some water?" The question hit her like a physical blow. When was the last time she had water? This morning, yesterday. The days had begun to blur together in a haze of hunger and desperation. I'm not sure." Without another word, Marcus walked to his truck and returned with a bottle of water and a small bag of chips. "Here, drink this slowly and eat these. They'll help with your blood sugar." Maggie's hands trembled as she accepted the offerings. The water was cold and perfect, and she had to force herself to sip it slowly instead of gulping it down. The chips were salty and satisfying in a way that made her realize just how depleted she had become. "Mrs. Whitfield, I don't mean to pry, but are you in some kind of trouble? I know things have been hard since Mr. Robert passed." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her resolve. Marcus had always been a good boy, raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. If anyone understood hardship, it was him. "I'm managing, Marcus. I just needed to see about something at the Strait place." Marcus studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him putting pieces together, her appearance, her location, the desperation he must have sensed. "Tell you what, why don't I give you a ride? It's still another 1.5 miles, and this heat isn't getting any cooler." Pride warred with practicality, and practicality won. "I'd appreciate that very much." The air conditioning in Marcus's truck felt like heaven against her overheated skin. As they drove toward the Strait ranch, Marcus filled the silence with gentle conversation about his wife, Rebecca Ann Reeves, and their 2 young children. He didn't ask any more probing questions, for which Maggie was grateful. She needed to preserve what little dignity she had left for the conversation ahead. The main gate to the Strait property was more impressive than she remembered. Wrought iron with the ranch's brand worked into the design. A small guardhouse sat to one side, occupied by a man in his 30s who waved at Marcus as they passed through. "You know, Mrs. Whitfield," Marcus said as they drove up the winding road toward the main house, "George Strait is good people. Whatever you need to discuss with him, I'm sure he'll be fair about it." Maggie nodded, not trusting her voice. How could she explain that she was about to beg her childhood neighbor for food? How could she admit that she had become the kind of person who knocked on doors asking for charity? The main house came into view, and Maggie's breath caught in her throat. It was beautiful. A sprawling ranch-style home with a wraparound porch and mature oak trees providing shade. Several outbuildings were visible in the distance, including what appeared to be a recording studio and guest quarters. Everything was immaculate, from the perfectly maintained grounds to the gleaming vehicles parked in the circular driveway. Marcus pulled up near the front porch and turned to face her. "Mrs. Whitfield, I want you to know that if things don't work out the way you're hoping, you call me. Rebecca and we've got a spare room, and we'd be honored to help however we can." The tears came then, despite her best efforts. This young man, with his own family to worry about, was offering her shelter when her own children had turned their backs. "Thank you, Marcus. That means more than you know." Family takes care of family, and in a place like this, we're all family. He handed her a business card with his personal cell phone number written on the back. Promise me you'll call if you need anything. Maggie nodded and carefully placed the card in her purse next to the photograph of Robert. As she stepped out of the truck, her legs felt steadier. Though whether from the water and chips or from Marcus's kindness, she couldn't say. The front porch was even more beautiful up close, with comfortable-looking chairs and hanging baskets full of colorful flowers. Maggie took a deep breath, smoothed her worn dress as best she could, and approached the heavy wooden door. Her reflection in the glass panels showed a woman she barely recognized. Thin, aged beyond her years, with eyes that had seen too much sorrow. Before she could lose her nerve, she lifted the brass knocker and let it fall 3 times against the door. The sound echoed through what she imagined was a spacious foyer, and she heard footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened to reveal a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple sundress and an apron dusted with flour. "Yes, can I help you?" "I'm sorry to bother you," Maggie began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Margaret Whitfield, and I was wondering if I might speak with George. We knew each other as children, and I—" She faltered, unsure how to continue. The woman's face lit up with recognition. "Margaret Whitfield. Oh my goodness, I remember George talking about you. I'm Norma, his wife. Please come in out of this heat." Maggie followed Norma into a beautifully appointed foyer with polished hardwood floors and family photographs covering the walls. The house smelled like baking bread and fresh flowers, scents that reminded her of her own home during happier times. "George is out in the back pasture checking on some new calves, but he should be back shortly. Can I get you something to drink? You look a little peaked from the heat." "Water would be wonderful, thank you." Maggie's voice was still shaky, but Norma's warmth was beginning to ease some of her anxiety. Norma led her to a comfortable living room with overstuffed chairs and a stone fireplace. "You just sit here and rest. I'll get you that water and maybe a little snack. I just pulled some banana bread out of the oven." As Norma bustled away toward what Maggie assumed was the kitchen, she looked around the room and felt a mixture of admiration and sadness. This was what a successful life looked like. Family photos spanning decades, awards and accolades displayed with quiet pride, evidence of a marriage and career that had flourished. It was everything she and Robert had dreamed of having before life took a different turn. Through the large windows facing the back of the property, she could see rolling pastures dotted with cattle and horses. In the distance, a figure on horseback was moving slowly among a group of cows and calves. Even from this distance, she recognized the easy way George sat in the saddle, the same natural grace he had possessed as a young man. Norma returned with a tall glass of ice water and a plate containing 2 thick slices of banana bread. "Here you go, dear. Now tell me, how have you been? George will be so excited to see you." Maggie sipped the water gratefully and took a small bite of the banana bread. It was delicious, moist and perfectly spiced, the kind of baking that came from years of practice and love. It's been a difficult time since my husband passed. Robert died 8 months ago, and things have been challenging." Norma's face immediately filled with sympathy. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry for your loss. Losing a spouse is one of life's greatest trials. George and I have been married 47 years, and I can't imagine—" The sound of a door opening interrupted her, followed by heavy footsteps and a familiar voice calling out, "Norma, whose truck was that in the driveway? Marcus leave his patrol car here again?" "We have a visitor, George. An old friend of yours." George Strait appeared in the doorway, still wearing his work clothes and cowboy hat, his face tanned from decades of outdoor work. At 73, he carried himself with the same quiet confidence that had made him a star, though his hair was silver now, and lines mapped the experiences of a life well lived. His eyes found Maggie, and for a moment time seemed suspended. She watched as recognition dawned on his face, followed by surprise and something that looked like genuine pleasure. "Margaret Whitfield," he said softly, removing his hat. "I'll be damned." George Strait stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the sight of his childhood neighbor. The years had changed her dramatically. The vibrant girl who used to race her horse across the fields had become a fragile woman with worry lines etched deep around her eyes. But her smile, tentative as it was, remained the same. "George," Maggie said, rising from her chair with some difficulty, "you look wonderful. Success suits you." He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and enveloped her in a gentle hug, the kind reserved for old friends and family. "Margaret, it's been far too long. Norma, did you offer our guest some of that banana bread?" "Already taken care of," Norma replied with a knowing smile. "I'll leave you two to catch up while I check on dinner." She squeezed Maggie's shoulder as she passed. "You just stay as long as you like, dear." George settled into the chair across from Maggie, his blue eyes studying her with concern. "I heard about Robert's passing through the grapevine. I meant to send flowers or come by, but you know how things get. I'm truly sorry for your loss, Margaret. Robert was a good man." "Thank you. He fought hard for 2 years, but the cancer finally won." Maggie's voice was steady, but George could hear the underlying pain. "He always spoke highly of you, said he was proud to tell people we grew up neighbors to George Strait. Hell, I was just lucky to know the Whitfields. Your daddy taught me more about cattle in 1 summer than most men learn in a lifetime." George leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "But I have a feeling you didn't walk all the way out here in this heat just to reminisce. What's going on, Margaret?" The directness of the question, delivered with kindness rather than judgment, nearly undid her. Maggie set down her water glass with trembling hands and struggled to find the words. "How do you tell someone you once built blanket forts with that you're essentially homeless and starving?" "I find myself in a difficult situation," she began carefully. "The medical bills from Robert's treatment were substantial. We had to mortgage the farm, and now the bank is foreclosing. I have 30 days to vacate the property." George's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. "My children, well, they have their own lives now. Jennifer is in Dallas with her husband's law practice, and Michael is in Houston. They both feel I should have managed things better." The words tasted bitter as she spoke them. "I've been living on savings and Robert's small social security benefit, but that runs out next week. Where are you planning to go?" The simple question hung in the air like a challenge. Maggie looked down at her hands, noting how thin they had become, how the wedding ring Robert had placed there 51 years ago now slid around her finger. "I don't know. I've looked into senior housing, but the waiting lists are months long, and I don't have months. I applied for assistance programs, but the paperwork takes time, and time is something I'm running short of." George was quiet for several minutes, processing what she had told him. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Maggie of the sunsets she and Robert used to watch from their front porch. "Margaret, I want you to be completely honest with me," George said finally. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" The question hit like a physical blow, and Maggie felt heat creep up her neck. It's been a few days. I had some crackers this morning, and Marcus gave me those chips." Christ. George stood abruptly and walked to the window, his hands clenched at his sides. "How long have you been going without food?" 2 weeks. Maybe 3. I've been rationing what I had, making things stretch." Maggie's voice was barely audible. "I came here because I didn't know where else to turn. I know it's presumptuous after all these years, but I was hoping, that is, I wondered if you might spare a little food. Just enough to get me through until I can figure out what comes next." George turned back to face her, and she was surprised to see anger in his eyes, not at her, but for her. "Margaret Whitfield, you listen to me. We grew up together. Our families helped each other through droughts, floods, and every kind of hardship this land could throw at us. The idea that you've been going hungry while trying to figure out how to ask for help." He shook his head. "It breaks my heart." "I'm not asking for charity," Maggie said quickly. "I can work. I may be older, but I'm still capable. I could clean, cook, help with whatever needs doing around the ranch. I just need a chance to get back on my feet." "Stop!" George's voice was firm but kind. "First things first. Norma!" He called toward the kitchen. "We're setting another place for dinner, and I want you to pack up some groceries for Margaret to take home." "Already on it," came Norma's cheerful reply. George sat back down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Now let's talk about your living situation. You said you have 30 days? 26 now. All right. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to stay for dinner, and Norma's going to send you home with enough food to last a couple of weeks. Tomorrow, I'm going to call my lawyer, Catherine Ann Foster, and have her look at your foreclosure paperwork. Sometimes banks make mistakes, and sometimes there are options people don't know about." Maggie felt tears threatening again. "George, I can't let you. You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to help an old friend because it's the right thing to do." His tone brooked no argument. "Now, while we're waiting for dinner, why don't you tell me what you've been doing with yourself these past few years? I know Robert ran cattle, but what about you?" The question gave Maggie a chance to compose herself and think about happier times. "I taught school for 37 years, mostly elementary. I loved those children like they were my own. After I retired, I helped Robert with the ranch and did some volunteer work at the county library. We had a good life, George. Quiet, but good. I remember you always had your nose in a book when we were kids. You used to read stories to us under that old oak tree by the creek. You remember that?" "Hell yes, I remember. You did voices for all the characters and everything. Made us feel like we were right there in the story with them." George smiled at the memory. "You know, I still have that creek on my property. The oak tree's bigger now, but it's still there." Before Maggie could respond, Norma appeared in the doorway, wearing a fresh apron. "Dinner's ready and I've made plenty. Margaret, I hope you like pot roast, because I made one big enough to feed half of Texas." The dining room was as beautiful as the rest of the house, with a large table that could easily seat 12 people. Family photographs lined the walls, showing George and Norma's children and grandchildren at various stages of their lives. There were also pictures of George, with famous musicians, award ceremonies, and candid shots from tours and concerts. As they sat down to eat, Maggie felt overwhelmed by the normalcy of it all. Here she was, sharing a meal with George Strait and his wife, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The pot roast was perfectly tender, accompanied by mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh cornbread that Norma had apparently made while they were talking. "So, Margaret," Norma said as they ate, "George tells me you were neighbors growing up. I'd love to hear some stories about him as a boy." Maggie smiled, feeling more relaxed than she had in months. "Well, he was always getting into trouble, but it was usually because he was trying to help someone or some animal that needed rescuing. I remember one summer when he found a baby deer that had been abandoned. His mother told him it needed to go back to the wild, but George insisted on bottle feeding it for weeks until it was strong enough to survive on its own." "That sounds like the George I married," Norma laughed. "He still brings home every stray animal he finds." "I was not that bad," George protested, but his eyes were twinkling with amusement. "What about the time you tried to teach your horse to swim in Miller's Pond?" Maggie asked. "Poor Thunder was so confused, and you were so determined. You spent the whole afternoon leading him back and forth through the shallow water, insisting that all horses could swim naturally. Did it work?" Norma asked. "Thunder learned to wade," George admitted, "but I wouldn't call it swimming exactly. As they continued sharing stories and memories, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine happiness. The food was delicious, the company was warm and welcoming, and for a brief time she could almost forget about the foreclosure notice and her uncertain future. After dinner, Norma insisted on packing what she called a few things for Maggie to take home. The few things turned out to be several bags full of groceries, fresh vegetables, meat, bread, canned goods, and even some homemade cookies. "Norma, this is too much," Maggie protested as they loaded the bags into George's truck. "Nonsense! I always cook too much anyway, and it'll just go to waste otherwise." Norma hugged her tightly. "You come back any time you want, you hear? And not just when you need something. I'd love to have another woman around to talk to occasionally." George drove her home as the sun finished setting, casting long shadows across the familiar landscape. The ride was comfortable, filled with easy conversation about their children and grandchildren, local gossip, and shared memories of people they had both known. When they pulled up to the Whitfield farm, Maggie felt a familiar pang of sadness. The house looked smaller and more run-down than she remembered, with peeling paint and a sagging front porch that Robert had been planning to fix before he got sick. The barn in the distance was missing several boards, and weeds had taken over what used to be Maggie's vegetable garden. "It needs work," she said apologetically as George helped her carry the groceries to the front door. "Nothing that can't be fixed," George replied diplomatically. "You know, Margaret, I meant what I said about having Catherine look at your paperwork, and I've been thinking we could use some help around the ranch. Norma's been after me to hire someone to help with the house, and we've got guests coming and going all the time with the recording studio and all." Maggie unlocked the front door and flipped on the porch light, illuminating the faded welcome mat that she and Robert had bought during their last trip to San Antonio. "I appreciate the offer, George, but I don't want to be your charity case." "You wouldn't be. We need the help, and you need the work. Seems like a fair trade to me." He set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter and looked around the small but tidy house. Besides, it would give Norma someone to fuss over. She misses having people around since the kids moved away. As George prepared to leave, he turned back to face her. "Margaret, I want you to promise me something. If you need anything, and I mean anything, you call me. Day or night, it doesn't matter. We're friends, and friends look out for each other." He handed her a business card with his personal cell phone number written on it, joining Marcus's card in her purse. "I'll call Catherine first thing Monday morning and have her come out to look at your situation. In the meantime, you eat those groceries and don't worry about anything else." After George left, Maggie stood in her kitchen surrounded by more food than she had seen in weeks. She put away the perishables and made herself a cup of the tea Norma had included, then sat at her small kitchen table and looked at the two business cards. For the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope. It was tentative and fragile, but it was there. She had forgotten what it felt like to have people care about her well-being, to have someone offer help without conditions or judgment. As she prepared for bed that night, Maggie allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to work at the Strait ranch, to have a purpose again and people to talk to during the long days. She thought about Norma's kindness and George's unwavering friendship, and for the first time since Robert's death, she fell asleep without crying. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made Texas autumns legendary. Maggie woke before dawn, as had been her habit for 68 years, but instead of lying in bed dreading the day ahead, she found herself energized by possibility. The groceries George and Norma had provided allowed her to make a proper breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee, luxuries she had rationed severely in recent weeks. At precisely 9 o'clock, a burgundy Lexus sedan pulled into her driveway. Through the kitchen window, Maggie watched a well-dressed woman in her 50s emerge from the driver's seat, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to solving problems. Catherine Ann Foster was nothing like the public defenders and legal aid lawyers Maggie had encountered during her attempts to navigate the foreclosure process. Tall and elegant, with auburn hair swept into a professional chignon, she possessed the kind of presence that commanded attention in courtrooms and boardrooms alike. "Mrs. Whitfield?" Catherine extended a manicured hand as Maggie opened the front door. "I'm Catherine Foster, George Strait's attorney. He asked me to review your situation and see what options might be available. Please come in. Would you like some coffee?" "That would be lovely, thank you." As Maggie prepared coffee in her small kitchen, Catherine surveyed the house with the practiced eye of someone who had seen financial distress in many forms. Unlike the bank representatives who had visited previously, her gaze was curious rather than judgmental, taking note of the well-maintained interior despite obvious signs of deferred maintenance. "George tells me you're facing foreclosure," Catherine said, as they settled at the kitchen table with steaming mugs. "I'd like to review all the paperwork if you don't mind. The original mortgage documents, medical bills, correspondence with the bank, everything." Maggie retrieved a shoebox from the bedroom that contained the accumulated paperwork of her financial crisis. As Catherine spread documents across the table, her expression grew increasingly focused, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Mrs. Whitfield, who represented you when you took out this second mortgage?" Catherine asked after several minutes of silent review. "No one. The bank said it was straightforward, and we couldn't afford a lawyer at the time. Robert was so sick, and the bills were coming so fast." Catherine's pen stopped moving. "You signed these documents without legal representation?" "Yes. They said it was just a formality, that people do it all the time." "Mrs. Whitfield, there are several irregularities in these documents that concern me greatly." Catherine's voice took on the crisp tone of a legal professional who had found her target. "The interest rate adjustment clause is potentially predatory. The disclosure requirements weren't properly met, and I see no evidence that the bank conducted the required counseling session for borrowers over 62. Maggie felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "Does that mean anything?" "It might mean everything. I'll need to do some research, but there's a good chance we can challenge this foreclosure on multiple grounds." Catherine gathered the papers and placed them carefully in her briefcase. "I'm going to take these documents with me if you don't mind. I'll have my paralegal Jessica Marie Rodriguez make copies and begin preparing a legal brief." "I can't afford to pay you," Maggie said quietly. "I know George arranged this consultation, but I want to be clear about my situation." Catherine waved dismissively. "George has been a valued client for many years, and he's made it clear that your representation is important to him. We'll work out the details later. Right now, let's focus on keeping you in your home." After Catherine left, with promises to call within 48 hours, Maggie felt energized in a way she hadn't experienced since before Robert's diagnosis. She spent the morning cleaning house with renewed vigor, washing windows and scrubbing floors until the small farmhouse gleamed. Just after noon, George's truck pulled into the driveway. This time, he wasn't alone. A woman in her early 30s with short blonde hair and kind green eyes climbed out of the passenger seat, followed by George himself. "Margaret, I'd like you to meet Amanda Claire Stevens, our ranch manager," George said as they approached the front porch. "Amanda, this is Margaret Whitfield, the neighbor I told you about." Amanda's handshake was firm and confident. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Whitfield. George has told me wonderful things about you. Please, call me Maggie. Would you both like to come in for coffee?" As they settled in the living room, Amanda pulled out a tablet and stylus. "George mentioned you might be interested in working at the ranch. I wanted to discuss what that might look like." "I don't want you to feel obligated," Maggie began, but George held up a hand. "Amanda came to me 6 months ago saying we needed help managing the guest house and coordinating the various people who come through for recording sessions and meetings. She's been handling it herself, but it's too much for one person. What would the position involve? Maggie asked. Amanda consulted her tablet. We typically have guests staying at the ranch 2 or 3 times a week. Musicians George is working with, business associates, family friends. The guest house has 4 bedrooms and can accommodate up to 8 people comfortably. We need someone to handle the housekeeping, meal planning, and general coordination. The guest house is fully furnished and has its own kitchen, George added. We built it about 5 years ago specifically for visitors, but Norma's got her hands full with the main house and her charity work. Maggie felt her heart racing. Are you suggesting I would live there? If you wanted to, Amanda replied. The position would include room and board, plus a salary. You'd have your own space, but you'd be close enough to handle the guest coordination. What kind of salary? Maggie asked, then immediately felt embarrassed by her directness. $40,000 a year to start, plus health insurance, George said. If it works out for everyone, we can discuss increases after the first year. Maggie stared at them both, certain she had misheard. $40,000 was more than Robert's Social Security benefit and her teacher's pension combined. With room and board included, it would allow her to rebuild her savings and plan for the future. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, Amanda suggested. Why don't we drive over to the ranch so you can see the guest house? That might help you decide. The guest house was even more beautiful than Maggie had imagined. Built in the same style as the main house, but smaller, it featured a spacious living area, full kitchen, 2 bathrooms, and a master bedroom that was larger than any room in her current house. French doors opened onto a private patio with a view of the pastures where horses grazed in the afternoon sun. The guests typically stay in the other 3 bedrooms, Amanda explained as they toured the house. You'd be responsible for preparing the rooms, coordinating meals, either cooking yourself or arranging catering, and generally making sure everyone has what they need. What kind of guests? Maggie asked. George answered, musicians, mostly, songwriters, producers, record label people. Sometimes family friends or business associates. Everyone's pretty low-key and respectful. Most of them are older, established professionals, not wild young kids. As they stood on the patio looking out over the ranch, Maggie felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before Robert's illness. The view stretched for miles, with rolling hills covered in native grass and scattered oak trees. In the distance, she could see cattle moving slowly across a hillside, and closer to the house, several horses stood in the shade of a large elm tree. It's beautiful, she said softly. The sunsets from this patio are something special, Amanda said. And there's a walking trail that goes around the property if you like to exercise outdoors. George leaned against the patio railing, his expression thoughtful. Margaret, I want you to understand something. This isn't charity, and it's not a favor to an old friend. We genuinely need help with this operation, and you have the skills and experience to do the job well. You managed a household for 50 years. You're organized, you're good with people, and you understand hospitality. Plus, Amanda added with a smile, Norma's already planning to teach you how to make her famous peach cobbler for the guests. They spent another hour touring the main ranch facilities, including the recording studio, where George worked on his music. The studio was a musician's dream, with state-of-the-art equipment and acoustics designed by experts. Gold and platinum records lined the walls, and Maggie felt a surge of pride for her childhood friend's incredible success. I record here about 3 days a week, George explained. Sometimes other artists come to work on projects, and occasionally we have songwriting sessions with multiple writers. Those are the times when the guest house gets the most use. As they prepared to leave, Amanda handed Maggie a folder containing a formal job description and employment contract. Take your time looking this over. There's no pressure to decide immediately. When would you need an answer? Maggie asked. Whenever you're ready, George replied. But we do have a group of songwriters coming next week for a 3-day session, so if you decide you're interested, we could start with that as a kind of trial run. That evening, Maggie sat at her kitchen table with the contract spread before her, reading every word carefully. The terms were more generous than she had dared hope, not just the salary and benefits, but provisions for vacation time, sick leave, and even a retirement contribution. It was the kind of employment package she had never imagined having at her age. The phone rang, interrupting her review. The caller ID showed Catherine Foster's office number. "Mrs. Whitfield, I have excellent news. We found several significant violations in your foreclosure proceedings, and I've already filed a motion to halt the process pending a full review." Maggie sank into her chair, overwhelmed by relief. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you're not losing your house next month. In fact, I believe we have grounds to challenge the entire second mortgage on the basis of predatory lending practices and failure to follow federal regulations for senior borrowers." Catherine's voice carried the satisfaction of a lawyer who had found her opponent's weakness. "I'll need to meet with you again later this week to prepare our formal response, but I wanted you to know immediately that the immediate threat has passed." "Catherine, I don't know how to thank you." "Thank George. He's the one who insisted I make this a priority." There was a pause. "Mrs. Whitfield, I've been practicing law for 26 years, and I see a lot of people taken advantage of by institutions that should know better. What happened to you was wrong, and I'm going to make sure it gets corrected." After hanging up, Maggie sat in her quiet kitchen and tried to process the day's events. 24 hours ago, she had been facing homelessness and starvation. Now she had the possibility of meaningful employment, a comfortable place to live, and legal representation that might save her family home. She thought about Robert and what he would say about these developments. He had always been a practical man who believed that when good fortune came your way, you should accept it gracefully and work hard to prove yourself worthy of it. Maggie picked up her pen and signed the employment contract. The next morning, she called Amanda to accept the position, and within hours, the efficient ranch manager had arranged for a moving truck to help transfer Maggie's belongings to the guest house. George insisted on paying the moving expenses, despite Maggie's protests. "Consider it a signing bonus," he said with a grin. The transition happened faster than Maggie had imagined possible. By Thursday afternoon, she was settled into her new home, surrounded by her familiar furniture and belongings, but with a view and amenities she had never dreamed of having. Norma arrived that evening with a casserole and an armload of linens for the guest bedrooms. "I thought you might like some company for your first night here," she said. "Plus, I wanted to show you how we usually set up the rooms for guests." As they worked together preparing the guest house for the upcoming visitors, Norma shared stories about previous guests and the various personalities Maggie might encounter. "Most of them are lovely people," she said as they made beds with crisp white sheets. "Professional musicians tend to be night owls, so don't be surprised if they're up late and sleep in, and they usually appreciate good coffee and simple, hearty food. I'm nervous about cooking for people with sophisticated tastes," Maggie admitted. "Honey, after months of hotel food and restaurant meals, most of them just want home cooking. Your pot roast and cornbread will be like a gift from heaven." Norma smoothed the bedspread on the king-sized bed and stepped back to admire their work. "Besides, if you're ever in doubt, just ask. I'm only a phone call away." Friday morning brought the arrival of the songwriting group, 4 men in their 40s and 50s who had driven down from Nashville for 3 days of collaborative work with George. Maggie watched from the guest house kitchen window as they unloaded guitars, notebooks, and recording equipment from 2 SUVs. The group's leader was Thomas William "Tommy" Henderson, a Grammy-winning songwriter who had written hits for everyone from Alan Jackson to Keith Urban. He was followed by David Michael Carroll, a producer whose work had shaped the sound of modern country music, and brothers Patrick James and Christopher Ryan O'Sullivan, whose harmonies had graced countless recordings. Amanda made the introductions as the men settled into their assigned rooms. "Gentlemen, this is Maggie Whitfield, our new guest coordinator. She'll be taking care of you during your stay." "It's a pleasure to meet you all," Maggie said, hoping her nervousness didn't show. "I've prepared a welcome lunch if you're hungry after your drive, and there's fresh coffee available anytime." Tommy Henderson, a tall man with graying temples and kind eyes, smiled warmly. "Mrs. Whitfield, after 3 hours in the car, good coffee sounds like salvation. Lead the way." The lunch was a success. Sandwiches made with Norma's homemade bread, fresh fruit, and the potato salad recipe that had been in Maggie's family for 3 generations. The men were easy to please and grateful for the hospitality, treating her with the respect due a valued professional rather than hired help. Over the next 3 days, Maggie settled into a routine that felt natural and satisfying. She prepared breakfast for early risers, kept the coffee pot full, managed lunch and dinner arrangements, and maintained the guest rooms. In the evenings, she could hear music drifting from the main house where the men worked with George, creating songs that might become hits on country radio. On Sunday morning, as the group prepared to leave, Tommy Henderson approached her with an envelope. "Mrs. Whitfield, I wanted to give you this personally." Inside was a handwritten note of thanks and a tip that was far more generous than anything she had expected. "Mr. Henderson, this is too much. It's exactly what you deserve. You made us feel welcome and comfortable, and that's not something we encounter everywhere we go." He paused at the guest house door. "I hope we'll see you again next time we come to work with George." After the guests left, Maggie sat on the patio with a cup of tea and reflected on her first week as a working woman again. The job felt right in a way that surprised her. She enjoyed the hospitality aspects, took pride in creating a comfortable environment for the guests, and found satisfaction in being part of George's professional operation. Amanda stopped by that afternoon for a debriefing session. "How did it go from your perspective?" she asked as they reviewed the week's activities. "Better than I expected. The gentlemen were all very considerate, and the work felt manageable." Maggie hesitated. "I do have one suggestion. The guest bathroom towels could be upgraded. The ones we have are fine, but for guests accustomed to high-end hotels, something more luxurious might be appreciated." Amanda made a note on her tablet. "That's exactly the kind of feedback I was hoping for. You have experience as a hostess that I lack, so please don't hesitate to suggest improvements." That evening, George and Norma invited Maggie to dinner at the main house, not as an employee, but as a friend and neighbor. As they sat around the familiar dining room table, Maggie felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. "You know," George said as Norma served her famous apple pie, "having you here feels right. Like the ranch is more complete somehow." "I feel the same way," Maggie replied. "For the first time since Robert died, I feel like I have a purpose again." The phone rang, and Norma excused herself to answer it. She returned a few minutes later with a concerned expression. "That was Catherine Foster. She wants to meet with you tomorrow morning about your foreclosure case. She said she has important news." Maggie felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. "Did she say whether it was good news or bad news?" "She said to plan on celebrating." Catherine Foster's law office occupied the top floor of a sleek glass building in downtown San Antonio with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the hill country. Maggie had never been in such an impressive professional environment, and she felt slightly intimidated as the elevator carried her to the 23rd floor. The reception area was furnished with leather chairs and abstract artwork that probably cost more than Maggie's annual teacher's salary had been. A young woman with dark hair and an efficient manner greeted her with a warm smile. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm Jessica Rodriguez, Mrs. Foster's paralegal. She's waiting for you in the conference room." Catherine was seated at a massive mahogany table, surrounded by neat stacks of legal documents and multiple manila folders. She rose as Maggie entered, her expression radiating the confident satisfaction of a lawyer who had achieved a significant victory. "Maggie, please sit down. I have news that I think you're going to want to hear." Catherine gestured to a chair across from her. "We've not only stopped the foreclosure, we've built a case that's going to result in a substantial settlement in your favor." Maggie sat down carefully, hardly daring to hope. "What kind of settlement?" First National Bank of Texas violated no fewer than 7 federal regulations in their handling of your loan, Catherine said, opening the largest folder. They failed to provide mandatory counseling for senior borrowers. They used predatory interest rate adjustments. They didn't properly disclose the terms of the variable rate structure, and they processed the foreclosure without following proper notification procedures. Jessica placed a document in front of Maggie as Catherine continued. "This is the settlement agreement we've negotiated. The bank has agreed to forgive the entire second mortgage, principal, interest, and penalties. That's approximately $137,000. Maggie stared at the numbers on the page, certain she had misunderstood. "Forgive the entire mortgage? Additionally, they're paying you $50,000 in damages for the stress and financial hardship their violations caused." Catherine's voice carried the satisfaction of justice served. "And they're covering all legal fees, so you won't owe my firm anything." The room seemed to spin slightly as Maggie processed the information. "You're telling me that not only do I keep my house, but I'll receive $50,000? That's exactly what I'm telling you. The settlement also includes a written apology from the bank's president and a commitment to review their lending practices for senior borrowers." Catherine leaned back in her chair. "Maggie, this is what we call a complete victory." Maggie felt tears coming and didn't try to stop them. "Catherine, I don't know how to thank you." "Thank George. He's the one who insisted I take your case and told me to spare no expense in fighting for you." Catherine's expression softened. "Besides, cases like this are why I became a lawyer. Financial institutions shouldn't be allowed to prey on vulnerable people." The settlement process took another 2 hours, with Jessica explaining each document and ensuring Maggie understood every aspect of the agreement. By the time they finished, Maggie felt emotionally drained but profoundly relieved. "The settlement funds will be deposited into your account within 5 business days, Catherine said, as they concluded. "And the mortgage forgiveness will be reflected in the county records by the end of the week." As Maggie prepared to leave, Catherine handed her a business card. "If you ever need legal advice about anything at all, you call me. Your family now." The drive back to the ranch gave Maggie time to process what had happened. She owned her house free and clear for the first time in 15 years. She had money in the bank for the first time since Robert's illness. And she had meaningful work that provided both income and purpose. More importantly, she had rediscovered something she thought she had lost forever, the knowledge that there were still good people in the world who cared about doing what was right. George was waiting for her when she arrived at the guest house, sitting on the patio with 2 glasses of iced tea. "Well?" he asked with a grin. "Do I need to break out the good champagne?" Maggie sat down beside him and shared the details of the settlement, watching his face light up with genuine pleasure at her good fortune. "George, I know you made this happen. Catherine told me you insisted she take the case and not worry about the cost. Catherine's the one who did the work. I just made sure she had the resources to do it right." George raised his glass in a toast to second chances and the power of good lawyers. As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, Maggie reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 2 weeks. She had gone from desperation to security, from isolation to community, from despair to hope. "I have some news of my own," George said after a while. Amanda's been so impressed with how you handled the songwriters that she wants to expand your role. We're thinking about hosting a summer music camp for high school students next year, and we'd need someone to coordinate the residential aspects. What would that involve? About 40 students for 2 weeks, staying in cabins we'd build near the guest house. They'd work with professional musicians and songwriters during the day, and we'd need someone to manage meals, activities, and general supervision. George's eyes were bright with enthusiasm. It would be like running a small resort, but for kids who are serious about music. The idea intrigued Maggie. After 37 years of teaching, she understood young people and their needs. It sounds wonderful, but I'd need help. 40 teenagers is a lot for one person to manage. We'd hire additional staff, of course. Amanda's already talked to Sarah Michelle Thompson, who runs the youth programs at the community center. She'd be interested in helping coordinate activities. George paused. We're also thinking about offering scholarships for students who couldn't otherwise afford to attend. Make it about the music, not about how much money their families have. That evening, Maggie called her children to share the news about the settlement. Jennifer's response was predictably focused on the money. $50,000? Mom, that's wonderful. You should invest it in a nice retirement account. Maybe look at one of those senior communities in Austin. I'm not ready to retire to a senior community, Jennifer. I have a job now, and I'm enjoying it. You're working? At your age? Jennifer's tone carried a mixture of surprise and disapproval. Mom, you're almost 70. You should be relaxing, not working. I'm 68, not 98, and the work gives me purpose. Maggie felt her patience beginning to fray. Besides, I like being useful again. Michael's response was more supportive, though colored by guilt over his earlier unwillingness to help. Mom, I'm glad things worked out for you. If you ever need anything, I'm fine, Michael, but thank you for the offer. After hanging up, Maggie realized that her children's reactions didn't hurt as much as they once would have. She was building a new life surrounded by people who valued her contributions and treated her with respect. Their approval, while still important, was no longer essential to her sense of self-worth. The following weeks brought a steady stream of guests to the ranch. Musicians working on recording projects, music industry executives attending business meetings, and family friends visiting George and Norma. Maggie found her rhythm managing the guest house, developing systems for everything from room preparation to meal planning. Her reputation as a hostess began to spread within Nashville's music community. Tommy Henderson recommended her services to other songwriter friends, and soon the guest house was booked weeks in advance. Amanda had to create a waiting list for people wanting to stay at the ranch during their visits to work with George. You've become part of the attraction, Amanda told her during one of their weekly planning meetings. People specifically ask if Mrs. Whitfield will be taking care of them during their stay. The success brought new challenges. Maggie found herself managing larger groups and more complex logistics. She hired Rebecca Ann Martinez, a recent culinary school graduate, to help with cooking for larger groups, and enlisted the help of Maria Elena Santos, a local woman who provided housekeeping services for several area ranches. By November, the guest house operation had evolved into a small but profitable hospitality business. Maggie was earning bonuses based on guest satisfaction scores, and Amanda had given her the title of Guest Services Director, along with a substantial raise. The music camp project was approved for the following summer, with Maggie designated as the residential coordinator. She threw herself into the planning with enthusiasm, drawing on her teaching experience to design programs that would be both educational and enjoyable for teenage participants. One evening in late November, as Maggie was reviewing applications for the music camp, George knocked on her door, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing a serious expression. "We need to talk," he said as she invited him in. Maggie felt a flutter of concern. Is something wrong? Not wrong exactly, but I've been thinking about something and I wanted to discuss it with you. George settled into one of the living room chairs. Norma and I are getting older, and we've been talking about the future of the ranch. Are you thinking about selling? God, no. This place is our life, but we need to start planning for what happens when we're not able to manage it anymore. George's expression was thoughtful. Our kids have their own careers and lives. They love the ranch, but they're not interested in running it day to day. What are you considering? A trust structure that would preserve the ranch as a working operation and music venue while providing for our family and the people who work here. George leaned forward. Maggie, you've become part of this place in a way that goes beyond just being an employee. You care about it the way Norma and I do. It feels like home, Maggie admitted. That's what I hoped you'd say. Because I want to discuss making you a permanent part of the ranch's future. George's voice carried the weight of a significant decision. What would you think about becoming a partner in the guest house operation? We'd formalize your role and give you an ownership stake in that part of the business. Maggie stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. A partner? You've built something special here. The guest house has become a destination in its own right, and that's entirely due to your efforts. George opened the wine bottle and poured 2 glasses. Amanda's run the numbers, and the guest house operation is profitable enough to justify expanding. We're talking about building additional cabins, maybe developing weekend retreat packages for songwriters and musicians. George, I don't have money to invest in a partnership. Your investment would be sweat equity, your experience, your reputation, your commitment to making it work. He handed her a glass of wine. Think of it as a recognition of what you've already contributed and an investment in what you can continue to build. As they discussed the details, Maggie felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. At 68, she was being offered an opportunity to become a business owner, to build something lasting that would provide security for her future and meaningful work for years to come. I'll need to think about it, she said finally. Of course, take all the time you need. George raised his glass. But I hope you'll say yes. This place wouldn't be the same without you. That night, Maggie sat on her patio, looking out over the ranch that had become her home and workplace. The transformation of her life seemed almost miraculous, from desperate widow facing homelessness to respected professional being offered a business partnership. She thought about Robert and what he would advise. He had always encouraged her to take calculated risks when the potential rewards were significant. This felt like one of those moments when caution needed to be balanced against opportunity. The next morning, she called Catherine Foster to discuss the legal implications of the partnership offer. The following week, she met with a financial advisor recommended by Amanda to understand the business projections and tax implications. Both professionals confirmed what her instincts had told her. This was a rare opportunity to secure her financial future while doing work she loved in a place that had become home. On a crisp December morning, Maggie walked into George's home office, where he was reviewing song charts at his desk. I've made my decision about the partnership, she said. George looked up with anticipation. And I'd be honored to accept. 6 months later, the Strait Ranch guest house had become legendary within Nashville's music community. The spring issue of Country Music Today featured a 3-page article titled "The Heart of Texas Hospitality," focusing on Maggie's transformation of the guest experience and the ranch's growing reputation as a creative retreat. The article included a photograph of Maggie standing on the guest house patio, wearing a simple dress and her grandmother's pearl necklace with the rolling Texas hills visible in the background. The caption read, "Margaret Whitfield, 69, brings decades of hospitality experience to one of country music's most sought-after destinations." Reading the article at her kitchen table on a sunny April morning, Maggie still felt amazement at how dramatically her life had changed. The woman in the photograph looked confident and content, a far cry from the desperate widow who had walked 3 miles in the heat to beg for food less than a year ago. The music camp was set to begin in 2 weeks, with 43 students accepted from across the country. The selection process had been competitive, with applications pouring in from talented young musicians whose essays about their passion for country music had moved Maggie to tears. True to George's vision, 12 of the spots were reserved for scholarship students whose families couldn't afford the full tuition. "Mrs. Whitfield," a voice called from the guest house front door, interrupting her reading. Maggie looked up to see Rebecca Martinez, her assistant chef, approaching with a concerned expression. "We have a situation with the Henderson Group's arrival. Their flight from Nashville was delayed, and they won't be here until after 9 tonight." "That's fine. We'll just move dinner to 10 o'clock and have a late welcome reception instead of the usual cocktail hour." Maggie made a note on her planning sheet. "Can you prepare the appetizer platters to hold them over when they arrive?" "Already done." I also took the liberty of calling the Morrison Vineyard to see if they could deliver some of their special reserve wine for the late dinner. Maggie smiled. Rebecca had proven to be not just an excellent chef, but an anticipator of needs and problems. "Perfect. You're becoming quite the hospitality professional yourself." The late afternoon brought Amanda's weekly planning meeting, which had evolved into strategic business discussions as the guest house operation expanded. They now managed bookings 6 months in advance and had a waiting list of potential guests that stretched well into the following year. "I've been reviewing the summer schedule," Amanda said as they sat in the guest house office that had once been a spare bedroom. "We're booked solid through September with a waiting list of 17 people for cancellations." "Maybe it's time to consider the cabin expansion we discussed," Maggie suggested. "George mentioned that the architects have finished the preliminary designs." "I think you're right. We could add 4 individual cabins without disrupting the main guest house, and they'd be perfect for longer-term stays." Amanda consulted her tablet. The construction timeline would have them ready for next spring, just in time for the 2nd year of the music camp. The music camp had become Maggie's particular passion. Working with Sarah Thompson and a team of professional music educators, she had developed a comprehensive program that combined intensive musical instruction with the kind of nurturing environment she had perfected as a teacher. The students would stay in newly constructed dormitory-style cabins, each housing 4 students with a supervising counselor. Meals would be served in a dedicated dining hall, and evening activities would take place in a multi-purpose building that doubled as a performance venue. "Speaking of the camp," Amanda continued, "we've received an inquiry from the Texas Music Educators Association about hosting their summer leadership workshop here next year. It would be a 3-day event for about 60 high school music teachers. That sounds wonderful. The more we can do to support music education, the better." Maggie made a note to discuss the proposal with George. As Amanda prepared to leave, she paused at the office door. "Maggie, I hope you know how much your partnership has meant to this operation. George always had the vision, but you've made it a reality." That evening, Maggie drove to town to have dinner with Catherine Foster, who had become a close friend as well as her attorney. They met at Giuseppe's, a family-owned Italian restaurant that had been serving the community for 3 generations. "You look radiant," Catherine said as they were seated at a corner table. "Success agrees with you." "I feel like I'm living someone else's life sometimes," Maggie admitted. "A year ago, I was sleeping in a house with no heat because I couldn't afford the electric bill. Now I'm being profiled in magazines and planning business expansions. You earned every bit of it through hard work and determination." Catherine raised her wine glass. "And you're providing something valuable, not just hospitality, but a sense of home for people who spend most of their time traveling." Over dinner, Catherine shared news about her own recent successes, including a high-profile case defending immigrant families against predatory lending practices. Her work on Maggie's case had led to several similar referrals, and she was building a reputation as an advocate for vulnerable populations. "I've been thinking about something," Catherine said, as they finished their entrees. "What you've built at the ranch could be a model for other similar operations. Have you ever considered franchising the concept or consulting with other properties?" The idea was intriguing. Maggie had received inquiries from other ranches and music venues about her methods and systems. "I hadn't thought seriously about it, but there's definitely interest. Something to consider for the future. You've created something unique that could benefit a lot of people." Catherine's expression grew more serious. "Speaking of the future, how are things with your children?" Maggie sighed. The relationship with Jennifer and Michael remained complicated. They were proud of her success, but seemed unable to understand why she chose to work rather than retire to a comfortable but passive lifestyle. "Jennifer visited last month. She's impressed by what I've accomplished, but she keeps asking when I'm going to slow down and act my age." Maggie smiled ruefully. "She doesn't understand that this work energizes me rather than exhausting me. Some people define success as the absence of challenge. Others define it as the presence of purpose." Catherine's voice carried the wisdom of someone who had seen many life transitions. "You've clearly chosen the latter." The next morning brought the arrival of the Henderson Group, Tommy Henderson and 3 other songwriters who had become regular guests at the ranch. Maggie greeted them with the warmth of an old friend, which is essentially what Tommy had become over the past months. "Mrs. Whitfield, I brought you something," Tommy said as she showed the group to their rooms. He handed her a wrapped package that felt like a book. Inside was a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "It's for recording your memories of this place and the people who've stayed here," he explained. "Every great hostess should keep a record of her stories." The gesture touched her deeply. That evening, after the guests had settled in for their songwriting session, Maggie sat on her patio and wrote the journal's first entry, April 15th. "Today I realize that home isn't always the place where you're born or where you raise your children. Sometimes home is the place where you discover who you're meant to become. This ranch has given me more than shelter and employment. It's given me a chance to build something meaningful with the time I have left. I think about Robert often and wonder what he would make of this new chapter. I believe he would be proud to see me thriving rather than merely surviving. The grief will always be part of me, but it no longer defines me." The following weeks passed quickly as final preparations for the music camp intensified. Maggie worked with Sarah Thompson to review applications and plan the curriculum, while Rebecca developed special menus designed to appeal to teenage tastes while maintaining nutritional balance. George took particular interest in the scholarship students, reviewing their application essays personally and ensuring that each recipient understood they belonged at the camp regardless of their family's financial circumstances. "Music shouldn't be a privilege reserved for the wealthy," he told Maggie as they reviewed the final roster. "Some of our greatest artists came from families with very little money, but enormous amounts of talent and determination." The first session of the Strait Ranch Music Camp began on a Monday morning in early June, with buses arriving from airports in San Antonio and Austin. Maggie stood with her staff as 43 teenagers and their parents gathered in the main meeting area for orientation. Watching the young faces filled with excitement and nervousness, Maggie felt a familiar surge of purpose that reminded her why she had loved teaching. These students were here not just to learn about music, but to discover what they were capable of achieving. "Welcome to the Strait Ranch Music Camp," George said as he addressed the group. Over the next 2 weeks, you're going to work with some of the most talented musicians and songwriters in the country. But more than that, you're going to discover the power of music to bring people together and express truths that can't be spoken any other way. The camp exceeded everyone's expectations. Students formed friendships that crossed regional and economic boundaries, collaborated on songs that showcased remarkable creativity, and performed in evening showcases that brought tears to the eyes of parents and staff alike. Maggie found herself serving as counselor, surrogate grandmother, and occasional mediator, as teenage emotions ran high during the intensive creative process. Her decades of teaching experience proved invaluable in managing the complex dynamics of talented young people pushed outside their comfort zones. On the final evening of the camp, the students performed an original song they had written collectively, with each participant contributing lyrics or melody. The song, titled "Where We Belong," spoke to themes of finding your place in the world and discovering that home can be anywhere you're accepted for who you truly are. As Maggie listened to the young voices harmonizing under the Texas stars, she felt a profound sense of completion. This was why she had survived the dark months of desperation, to be here in this moment, helping young people discover their potential. After the students departed, the ranch felt unusually quiet. Maggie spent the following day walking the property, visiting the spots that had become significant to her over the past year. She stopped at the oak tree by the creek, where she and George had played as children, now grown massive with age, but still providing shade and beauty. That evening, George and Norma invited her to dinner to celebrate the success of the music camp. As they sat on the main house patio watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, George raised his glass in a toast. To Maggie Whitfield, who proved that it's never too late for a new beginning. To friendship, Norma added, and the power of good people taking care of each other. Maggie felt tears threatening as she raised her own glass. To second chances and the grace that comes when you least expect it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Maggie reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had knocked on George's door as a desperate woman with nothing left to lose. Tonight, she sat as his partner and friend, surrounded by the life she had built through determination, hard work, and the kindness of people who had chosen to believe in her. The ranch was quiet now, with no guests scheduled until the following week. But Maggie knew that the silence was temporary. Soon the guest house would be filled again with musicians and songwriters, the recording studio would ring with new melodies, and she would continue doing the work that had given her life new meaning. In her journal that night, she wrote, June 30th. Today marks 1 year since I walked down Farm Road 1176 in desperation, carrying nothing but $5 and a lifetime of grief. Tonight, I write this entry as a successful businesswoman, surrounded by friends who have become family, in a home that represents everything I thought I had lost forever. I've learned that rock bottom can be a foundation rather than an ending. The worst day of your life might be the prelude to the best chapter you've never imagined. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can receive is the opportunity to give something back. Tomorrow, I begin planning next year's music camp, with applications already arriving from young people who want to spend 2 weeks discovering what they're capable of becoming. I understand now that this work, nurturing talent, creating sanctuary, building community, is what I was meant to do with the time I have been given. Robert used to say that every ending is also a beginning if you have the courage to see it that way. I finally understand what he meant. As Maggie closed the journal and prepared for bed, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life being lived with purpose. Outside her window, the Texas night was filled with the sounds of cattle settling in the pastures, night birds calling to each other across the hills, and the gentle whisper of wind through the oak trees. She was home. 3 years later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Strait ranch as Maggie Whitfield walked the familiar path from the guest house to the main residence, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and the day's schedule. At 71, she moved with the confident stride of a woman who had found her place in the world and intended to make the most of every day she had been given. The ranch had grown substantially in the 3 years since she had become George's partner. What had begun as a simple guest house operation now included 12 individual cabins, a dedicated conference center, and facilities that could accommodate up to 100 visitors for special events. The Strait Ranch Music Camp had expanded to 4 sessions each summer, with a waiting list that stretched 18 months into the future. Marcus Reeves, the deputy sheriff who had given her a ride on that desperate day so long ago, now served as the ranch's security coordinator, overseeing safety for the larger events and workshops they hosted throughout the year. His wife, Rebecca, had joined the staff as the activities coordinator, bringing her background in recreational therapy to help design programs for guests with special needs. "Good morning, partner," George called from the main house porch, where he sat with his morning coffee and a stack of music industry publications. At 76, he remained actively involved in the ranch's operations, though he had gradually shifted more responsibility to Maggie and Amanda as his focus turned toward mentoring younger artists. "Good morning, George. Ready for the chaos?" Maggie settled into her usual chair beside him, reviewing the day's agenda. "We have the songwriters workshop starting this morning, the Nashville documentary crew arriving for the afternoon filming session, and the Austin music teachers group checking in tonight." "Sounds like a typical Tuesday," George grinned. "Remember when we thought 40 guests was overwhelming?" The transformation had not gone unnoticed by the music industry. The ranch now hosted an annual songwriters retreat that had become one of the most prestigious events in country music, with established artists working alongside emerging talent in an environment that fostered collaboration and creativity. Music education organizations regularly brought their members for professional development workshops, and the ranch had become a case study in successful arts-based community development. Maggie's personal transformation had been equally remarkable. The shy, desperate woman who had once begged for food had evolved into a confident business leader whose opinion was sought by hospitality professionals across the country. She had been invited to speak at conferences about rural tourism, senior employment, and second career success. Her relationship with her children had also evolved, though slowly. Jennifer had finally visited during the previous summer's music camp, watching in amazement as her mother coordinated the complex logistics of managing 100 teenagers while maintaining the warmth and personal attention that had become her trademark. "I never knew you had this in you," Jennifer had admitted during their walk around the property. "I always thought of you as just Mom. I didn't realize you were also a businesswoman and community leader." Michael had been more direct in his appraisal. "Mom, I owe you an apology. When you needed help, I told you to sell the house and downsize. I couldn't see that what you needed wasn't a smaller life, but a bigger one." The success had brought unexpected opportunities. Maggie had been approached by several publishing companies about writing a book on hospitality management, and a cable television network had expressed interest in developing a documentary series about second-act careers. She had politely declined most of these offers, preferring to focus on the work that brought her joy rather than pursuing celebrity. The one project she had accepted was a consulting contract with the Texas Department of Agriculture to help develop agri-tourism guidelines for family ranches. Her experience in transforming the Strait Ranch into a destination had proven valuable to other rural families looking to diversify their income streams while preserving their agricultural heritage. Mrs. Whitfield? Amanda approached from the direction of the guest house, tablet in hand, and the efficient expression that indicated a busy day ahead. The Henderson Group would like to extend their stay through Friday if we have availability, and I've got 3 calls from other writers asking about last-minute openings this week. What's our occupancy looking like? Maggie asked, pulling out her own planning tablet. The technology had taken some adjustment, but she had embraced the digital tools that made managing the complex operation possible. We're at 85% for the week, with flexibility in 2 of the cabins. Amanda consulted her screen. I can accommodate the Henderson extension and one of the new requests. As Amanda headed back to handle the bookings, George turned to Maggie with a thoughtful expression. You know, I've been thinking about something Catherine mentioned last week. Catherine Foster had become not just Maggie's attorney, but a close friend and frequent visitor to the ranch. Her law practice had grown to include a specialty in rural development law, and she often brought clients to the ranch as an example of successful community-based enterprise. What did Catherine say? Maggie asked. She thinks we should consider establishing a foundation to support music education in rural communities. Use some of the ranch's profits to fund programs for schools that can't afford comprehensive music education. George's eyes held the enthusiasm that always appeared when he talked about supporting young musicians. We could call it the Strait Whitfield Foundation for Rural Music Education. The idea resonated deeply with Maggie. Her teaching background had shown her how dramatically music education could impact young people's lives, particularly in communities where opportunities were limited by economic circumstances. I love the concept. We could offer grants for instruments, fund teacher training, maybe even provide scholarships for students to attend music camps and workshops. Maggie's mind was already working through the possibilities. We have the infrastructure here to host training programs, and our network of professional musicians could serve as mentors and instructors. I was hoping you'd feel that way. George smiled. I've already asked Catherine to research the legal requirements for establishing a charitable foundation. She thinks we could have it operational by next year. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the morning's first guests, 5 songwriters from Nashville who were participating in a week-long intensive workshop. Maggie excused herself to oversee their check-in, a process that had evolved into a carefully choreographed welcome experience. Each guest received a personalized welcome packet containing their room assignment, a schedule of activities, information about ranch amenities, and a handwritten note from Maggie expressing appreciation for their choice to stay at the ranch. The personal touch had become one of the operation's distinguishing features, setting it apart from corporate hotels and generic retreat centers. Mrs. Whitfield, it's wonderful to see you again, said Daniel Robert Stevens, a Grammy-winning songwriter who had become a regular guest. I was telling my wife about your ranch, and she's insisting on coming with me next time. She'd be very welcome. We love having family members join our guests when possible. Maggie handed him his welcome packet and room key. Rebecca has prepared your favorite breakfast items, and the studio is ready for your 10 o'clock session. The personal relationships Maggie had built with regular guests had become one of the ranch's greatest assets. Musicians often planned their touring schedules around availability at the ranch, and many had written songs inspired by their experiences there. The guest house walls now featured framed photographs of visitors alongside gold and platinum records from albums that had been conceived or written during ranch stays. As the morning progressed, Maggie moved seamlessly between her various responsibilities, coordinating with the kitchen staff on meal preparations, reviewing cabin assignments with the housekeeping team, and discussing logistics with the documentary crew that was filming a segment about the ranch's impact on the local community. The documentary, being produced for a national cable network, was part of a series about innovative rural businesses. The producers had been particularly interested in Maggie's story, the widow who had transformed personal crisis into professional triumph while helping revitalize her rural community. Mrs. Whitfield, can you tell us about the economic impact the ranch has had on the local area? Asked Jennifer Lynn Patterson, the documentary's director. Maggie had become comfortable with media interviews, having learned to balance honesty about her struggles with focus on the positive outcomes. When we started expanding the guest house operation, we committed to sourcing as much as possible from local businesses. Our food comes from area farms, our linens and furnishings from regional suppliers, and our construction and maintenance work from local contractors. The numbers were impressive. The ranch now employed 23 people directly, from housekeeping and grounds maintenance to activity coordination and administrative support. Indirectly, the operation supported dozens of additional jobs in the surrounding community through its purchasing and contracting relationships. What's been the most rewarding aspect of this transformation for you personally? Jennifer asked. Maggie considered the question carefully, wanting to give an answer that captured the full scope of her experience. I think it's been discovering that age doesn't have to mean limitation. At 68, when I thought my useful life was ending, I found out that my most meaningful work was just beginning. Every young person who comes through our music camp, every guest who finds inspiration during their stay here, every local family that benefits from the economic opportunities we've created, they're all part of a legacy I never imagined I'd be able to build. Later that afternoon, as the documentary crew finished their filming, Maggie took her usual walk around the property. The path now included stops at the music camp amphitheater, where evening performances had become legendary among participants and their families, and the memorial garden she had created in honor of Robert and other family members who hadn't lived to see the ranch's transformation. The garden featured native Texas wildflowers and a simple stone bench where guests often came to reflect and find inspiration. A small plaque read, "In memory of those who believed in dreams they didn't live to see fulfilled." As she sat on the bench, Maggie reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. The ranch had become more than a business. It was a community hub, a center for musical education and creativity, and a model for rural economic development. But more personally, it had given her a way to channel her grief into purpose, her loss into service to others. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Catherine. "Foundation paperwork approved. We're officially the Strait Whitfield Foundation for Rural Music Education. Ready to change some lives?" Maggie smiled as she typed back, "Ready to change the world, one young musician at a time." That evening, the ranch hosted its monthly community dinner, an event that had evolved from Maggie's desire to maintain connections with local families who had been part of the area long before the ranch became famous. Neighbors, ranch employees, and any guests who wanted to participate gathered for a potluck-style meal in the conference center. "I want to share some exciting news," George announced as the group settled in for dessert. "Maggie and I have established a foundation that will provide music education grants to rural schools and scholarships for young musicians to attend camps and workshops." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause, particularly from the local teachers and parents who understood the impact such support could have on their children's opportunities. Our first initiative will be a partnership with the county school district to fund a traveling music teacher who can serve the smaller elementary schools that currently don't have music programs, Maggie added. "We're also planning to offer summer workshops here at the ranch specifically for students from our local schools." As the evening wound down and neighbors began heading home, Maggie felt the deep satisfaction that came from being truly integrated into a community. These were the people who had welcomed her when she was struggling, who had supported the ranch's growth, and who would continue to be part of its future. Later, as she and George sat on the guest house patio reviewing the day's successes and planning for tomorrow's activities, he raised a topic that had been on both their minds. "Maggie, I've been thinking about succession planning for the ranch. Norma and I aren't getting any younger, and while you're still going strong, we need to start considering the long-term future." The subject wasn't morbid, but practical. George was 76, Norma was 74, and while both remained healthy and active, the ranch's continued success required planning for leadership transitions. "What are you thinking?" Maggie asked. "Amanda's proven herself as an exceptional manager, and she has the business skills to handle the operational side. But the soul of this place, the hospitality, the community connections, the educational mission, that comes from you." George's expression was serious. "I'd like to explore the possibility of gradually transferring ownership of the guest house operation to you completely, with Amanda as your partner." The proposal was both flattering and daunting. At 71, Maggie was being offered the opportunity to become the primary owner of a business that had become central to her identity and purpose. "What about your family? Your children should inherit their share of what you've built. My kids will inherit the main ranch and the music rights, but this hospitality operation is something you created. It should be yours to carry forward." George's voice carried the certainty of a decision carefully considered. "Besides, I can't think of anyone I'd rather trust with preserving what we've built here." That night, Maggie sat in her comfortable living room, surrounded by the photographs and mementos that chronicled her transformation from desperate widow to successful entrepreneur. On her desk was the leather journal Tommy Henderson had given her, now filled with stories of the hundreds of guests who had stayed at the ranch and the young musicians who had discovered their potential at the music camps. She opened to a fresh page and began writing. December 15th, today. George offered me something I never imagined possible, the chance to own completely the business we built together. At 71, I'm being asked to take on responsibilities that would challenge someone half my age. The logical response would be to decline, to enjoy the security I've achieved without taking on additional risk. But logic wasn't what brought me to this ranch 4 years ago. Desperation led me here, faith sustained me, and love for this place, these people, this work, has made me whole again. I think about the young woman I was at 21, marrying Robert and dreaming of the life we would build together. I could never have imagined that my greatest achievements would come after his death, that losing everything would lead to gaining more than I had ever hoped for. Tomorrow, I'll tell George, yes. Not because I'm not afraid, but because I've learned that fear and excitement often feel exactly the same. The difference is in what you choose to do with the feeling. This ranch has given me more than a home and a livelihood. It's given me proof that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. And if my story can inspire others to believe in second chances, third chances, and the possibility of transformation at any age, then every moment of struggle will have been worth it. The girl who used to read stories under the oak tree by the creek has become a woman who helps others write new chapters in their own lives. Sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is the opportunity to give something back. And sometimes home finds you just when you need it most. As Maggie closed the journal and prepared for bed, she could hear the faint sound of music drifting from one of the cabins where guests were having an impromptu songwriting session. The melody was new, created by artists who had found inspiration in the peaceful sanctuary she had helped create. Outside her window, the Texas night was filled with the familiar sounds of the ranch, cattle in the distance, the whisper of wind through the oak trees, and the quiet contentment of a place where dreams came true through hard work, kindness, and the courage to begin again. She was exactly where she belonged.